after that story came out, men then came to the encampment looking to solicit people. Anyone who is coming forward to share their story is doing so at a certain degree of risk. Traditionally, when you're interviewing someone who's been through trauma, you're interviewing them when it's over. But when you're covering homelessness, that person is still living in their trauma. Traditional media has emphasized encampment's impact on the surrounding community, but not always gone into the encampment and tried to understand how people ended up living there and what it would take to actually resolve. All of a sudden now, the viewers, they're getting to know the people who are actually living on the street. Our stories are really resonating because it feels real to people and it feels true to what's happening. I just try to give people as much agency as I can in how they want their story to be told.
Reporting on homelessness is going to be more vital as homelessness grows and legacy media continues to lay off reporters. So the topic of homelessness is going to take a hit. Kate Cagle is one of my favorites. She always includes the voice of homeless people. Kate Cagle is an anchor and reporter for Spectrum News 1 here in Southern California. And I'm so happy to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's high praise coming from someone who I know is making a big impact in homelessness and the way people think about this crisis. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation.
So why do you believe that homelessness is an important topic to be covered today?
I mean, well, I live in West Los Angeles, and it's reached the point of this crisis where people see it all around them. And I think a lot of folks, and including our viewers, struggle to understand how things got this bad. And they're having a really hard time understanding why it continues to be so bad. So I'm really glad that Spectrum News 1 in Los Angeles, where I work, has made it a priority to cover the crisis from all angles, different viewpoints, different communities, to show how it's impacted and also try to really understand it.
You are very unique, in my opinion, that you really feature the voice of homeless people and people with lived experience in your reporting. Can you talk about that and why you do it and why you feel it's important?
Yeah. So when Spectrum launched in Los Angeles in 2018, we really emphasized every single story had to have this approach that we called character driven. So we would take an issue and we would explain it through the eyes of someone who was experiencing that issue. And I think in homelessness, then it just really viscerally felt to all of us that this was a crisis that needed to be covered on the ground and actually talking to people who were experiencing homelessness, people who are trying to get off the streets. The only way you can really understand why this crisis continues to get worse is talking to these individuals and the barriers that they're facing to moving on with their lives, to getting into a shelter or housing. Why is it that people don't like the shelters? Why is it that they wait for years with Section 8 vouchers to actually get an apartment at the end of the day? The only way to really tell that story is to talk to the people who are experiencing it. And I think that it also creates a lot of empathy because all of a sudden now the viewers, they're getting to know the people who are actually living on the street, and it's humanizing them.
You said something, I'm smiling because you said character driven. And I've been, I was watching some of your stories last night and I'm trying to put in my head, what would I call that? And character driven is really the right term because you're telling the stories through the people and you're augmenting it in a way to help the general public understand. So I love the term character driven. I'm going to probably steal that a little bit.
A part of that and a part of good journalism is leaning into complicated characters. Sometimes when I'm working on a piece, I wonder if the public is going to find this person sympathetic. And I think not being afraid to explore, the parts of their journey that some people might not agree with. People who are struggling, many people on the street are struggling with addiction and drug abuse and sobriety. And I found that people are really open to talking about that. And I think that that's a reason that our stories are really resonating, because it feels real to people and it feels like we're being true to what's happening.
I can so relate because Invisible People, we put up stories of homeless people that are raw, unedited. And often I will view a person's story and say, oh my gosh, this is not going to resonate with the public. And what I've learned is that you can't market to yourself, right? I've put up stories that I thought people would hate, and they loved that person. They totally found empathy in that person's story. So I try not to, I mean, we all judge, right? Try not to judge. And from a journalistic perspective, or even from a nonprofit marketing perspective, I think the stories themselves that are good stories, the public will resonate with. How do you find those good stories? I mean, you even said some of them can be challenging. What's your tips?
Yeah. I mean, I work a lot with advocates, with people who are either with mutual aid groups or even with some of the government agencies that are working with these encampments to try to move people into housing. That was how I met Randy, which was one of the first in-depth stories I did. This was a young man who was living in Venice. He was sleeping outside the Gold's Gym there, which up until recently was a notorious encampment on the West Side. He had come to Venice wanting to make it as an artist. He was kind of embracing this vagabond lifestyle, but he did want to get off the street. Ultimately, he did want to live in an apartment, but when he would go to these housing agencies, there just simply wasn't anything in West LA that was affordable to him. And he was working with an advocate, basically a do-gooder named Will Hawkins. Will tried everything. I mean, he tried getting him jobs. He tried getting him couches to sleep on. He tried getting him home to his family on the East Coast. And Randy, over the years, just kept falling back into homelessness. He was dealing with addiction. And the thing about Randy is he so badly wanted to be a success story, especially because I was following him, and he wanted to be a success story for homelessness, to show people that they can prevail, that they can make it out. So it was devastating a year ago when we found out that Randy had been found dead on the street of a fentanyl overdose. And for me, it just really drove home, the impossibility that some people can face when it comes to trying to, work the system or even pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Just really hard to make it in LA. It's an expensive city to live in. And then if you're dealing with other barriers, mental health barriers, addiction, it can just be really hard to keep a toehold in the city.
Well, what you're talking about is we need to get people off the street into housing quickly, right? We need to prevent homelessness so somebody like Randy doesn't fall into homelessness. And then when someone like Randy ends up on homelessness, we need to get them out before addiction and mental health continues to get worse. You text me last night. Randy's story was what got you into telling the story of homelessness. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I just spent some time shadowing him on the boardwalk. I went with him to one of those shared housing providers where they showed him the list of what was available. And it was homes that were, miles away from where he wanted to live. And when he was given that choice, he chose the street. To me, Randy was an example of kind of a lifestyle in LA that used to exist. You could come to LA and be in a band and be a bar back and work kind of odd jobs and make enough to keep yourself housed. And that's just not the reality for many people here today. There's a lot of people that you meet on the street, particularly young people, who come to LA with this dream that they're going to be able to make it here. And I've interviewed many people who eventually they go from sleeping on couches to then they find themselves in their car, and then the car gets towed, and then they're sleeping on the street, and then that's really unsafe. So they find an encampment, and that's how it kind of becomes this lifestyle that essentially they're trapped in after a while.
When you're going out to do the story of homelessness, I mean, in today's world, we have to be safe. I mean, Walmart, grocery stores, theaters, schools can be dangerous, but safety has to come first. I always try to go with at least one other person. What do you advise, and how do you go out?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that, over the years, I've learned a lot, and I try not to work alone. Even if I'm not working with another journalist, like I know enough people who are working mutual aid or with different nonprofits or city agencies that if there's a particular encampment that I'm interested in covering, or sometimes they'll come to me because something's developing, like there's an inside safe operation happening, which is where they're offering hotel rooms to the encampment. And in turn, they're going to be sweeping the streets and no longer allowing people to sleep on that particular block. So I actually rarely work alone anymore. If I'm going to an encampment, I try to go with someone who already has a relationship there, who knows the folks who are living there, to make sure that, someone is going to be willing to talk to me, because there's a reason that a lot of people who live in these encampments can be wary of media. And as you said, traditional media has emphasized on the encampment's impact on the surrounding community, but not always gone and then turned and gone into the encampment and tried to understand how people ended up living there and what it would take to actually resolve that situation. And I've had some really compelling stories. One came to mind was it was during the pandemic, and the story premise was sanitation for people who are living on the street and access to bathrooms. And I went to Skid Row's, one of the encampments we talked about, and met a woman there who I was working by myself, but we really connected, and she really opened up about the frustration of just trying to go to the bathroom and wash her hands when she woke up every morning, and the impossibility of it. So there were times when you can make a connection like that, but over the years I've learned it's really best to work with either a nonprofit or a mutual aid group or a government agency that already has relationship and has built trust in that particular area.
You're really good at getting homeless people to feel comfortable to tell their stories. How do you do that? How do you get people that are, going through layers of trauma, maybe have mental health and addiction problems, to open up and talk to you?
Well, I think it's really important when you're covering homelessness to be mindful of what the industry is now calling trauma-informed reporting. So it was really interesting because I actually went to a workshop on this, and I asked the woman who was leading the workshop, I do a lot of work with homelessness. How should I translate what you're teaching now to that? And she pointed out that, traditionally when you're interviewing someone who's been through trauma, you're interviewing them when it's over. And the risk is re-traumatizing them by bringing up the past. But when you're covering homelessness, that person is still living in their trauma. They're not even at the point of this journey where they have safety or security. So kind of throwing out the playbook on like a lot of journalistic practices. I learned over the years that when I'm covering an encampment, not to be specific where it is. That was because a young woman named Gwen told me that she was living at a notorious encampment. Another local station had done a story about it. The story alleged that prostitution was happening there. And Gwen told me that there hadn't been prostitution happening there. But after that story came out, men then came to the encampment
Oh,
looking
wow.
to solicit people.
Wow.
And she was a runaway who had nothing but, a tent to protect her at night. And all of a sudden, these men were showing up looking for young women like her.
Wow.
And to me, that was really, a turning table for me when I realized, anyone who is coming forward to share their story is doing so at a certain degree of risk. So I try not to, lead the viewer to exactly where they are. A lot of
Yeah.
people have street
So
names. I
important.
let them use street names. They
So
don't want to
important.
be found. I just try to give people as much agency as I can in how they want their story to be told, because a lot of people, they're willing to be open about the challenges. I also think the other trade-off is when you're doing this kind of work, it's why I also put a big emphasis on accountability reporting. I try to ask tough questions of the people who are in charge and in power, and be aware of that power dynamic, because if someone's willing to be vulnerable and open up about something that's incredibly shameful in our society, the least I can do is try to get answers for them
Yeah.
and to try to put pressure on elected officials to do the right thing.
I am the same way. I'm very cautious about any identifying information. Like I'll say downtown Los Angeles, but I won't say where downtown. And I'm real careful of trying not to
Right.
have a street sign in the shot. Is there any other tips to journalists in covering homelessness, in both how to protect homeless people, but also how to protect the journalists and get better stories?
The biggest tip is just to always follow up. The best investigative reporting is following up on the reporting that you've already done. So it's staying in touch, coming back to that person a month or two later. Hey, where are you at with your journey? And then follow up regardless of where it went. I mean, sometimes it's a success story. The person makes it into housing. I sent you the story I did with Tanu, which was really powerful. He was able to get into a diversion program. He was arrested actually for assault. He'd been living on the street for 20 years. And he was really open with me about his struggle with drug abuse. It had led him to sex work. He was living in Hollywood on the street when he was arrested. He'd been arrested dozens of times. And when I met him, he was at essentially a halfway house in this experimental diversion program where he, instead of jail, got put into an unlocked facility, but it had wraparound doctors, therapists, people who helped him enroll in community college. And he said that they really wrapped their arms around him. He ended up getting his first apartment in decades and an associate's degree, and now is changing his life to help others. So sometimes you get those success stories, and sometimes you see where people fall through the cracks and fall back onto the street. So yeah, my biggest advice for reporters is just to keep following up with these folks.
One thing I really adore about that story is I feel it was really authentic, because at one point he ran away, right? He took off, and being on parole or whatever, that's not necessarily a good thing. You could have avoided that. You could have avoided that whole piece there, or you could have highlighted on it. I mean, the power is really in the editing. It made the story more authentic. And then he came back, or was brought back, and he's now having a path to a successful life. And I think that is so important in reporting. I know we've done a lot of videos in Venice, and we don't skirt around addiction and mental health. We do it in a way that's authentic. We also message and highlight housing as a solution, but we don't ignore or cut out those pieces of stories, which often are either highlighted, they're all addicts, or they don't talk about those topics.
Well, and I think that even, I know you're focused on housing as a solution, but we do plenty of stories about, okay, great. Well, where is the housing? What's happening with these Section 8 vouchers? I mean, I'm sure you've encountered,
Oh my God.
there's hundreds of people living on the street with a Section 8 voucher where the federal government will pay their rent if they can just find a landlord to accept it. And, the agency says that the LA market is just too competitive.
Yeah.
A lot of
Right.
folks disagree with that. They think that the agencies just drop the ball when it comes to following up and being competitive in the rental market. But I think it's just always trying to kind of find where the friction is, because it is a really complicated crisis. And there's just a million different angles you could explore where the ball is being dropped.
Well, one of my things that drives me crazy is they give a homeless person a voucher who might not have a phone or be able to charge a phone or a car or money for a bus pass, and they depend on that person to find their own apartment. And that person might have an eviction in their past or bad credit. I mean, the thinking of, okay, we got a voucher for you here, go find a place, to somebody that doesn't have resources is a huge failure of the homeless services system. In the topic of homelessness, which may change tomorrow, what do you feel are the top topics that we should be covering?
I mean, I think just always starting with the individual experience is a great place to start. And that will give you enough leads to then just start pulling the threads on anyone's individual journey and the roadblocks that they ended up facing. And the city, the county, the state, they're continuously launching these new programs. Often they're pilots. So following up and following the money as much as you can, which can be really difficult to try to figure out just, where all these billions of dollars are going, what's working, what's not working. And like that diversion program with Tanu is extremely successful. The rate of success is far better than jail, but it is just nowhere near the scale that it would need to be to address a crisis where there's, nearly 50,000 people sleeping on the street. Like there's just nothing right now in government that matches the scale of the problem.
Los Angeles has historically done too little, too late. They talk good, but that has been the problem. In a document that we're going back with Adam Rose that started all this with the LA Press Club, you wrote something that I thought is just so, you wrote a lot of things, but you said, if showing cleaning up street, where are the people? We shouldn't be celebrating the disappearance of people. Can you talk about that?
I mean, I think that that's been a major obstacle with covering, Mayor Karen Bass's Inside Safe initiative, which is focused on the goal is to clear encampments and create clean sidewalks. Although sometimes the clean sidewalk ends up surrounded by a fence anyway, and people still can't walk on it. But I just think that, okay, fine. But the real reporting is, where did the people go? So did they end up in a hotel? Are they happy in the hotel? Are they on the path to success? Because, people are going into these hotels and there are people who are excited for that opportunity, but there are people who are just taking their belongings and moving down the street. And all of a sudden, the encampment pops up in another neighborhood, which is the same thing that was happening under the Garcetti administration. And I'd also like to remind people that, when Mayor Eric Garcetti, Bass's predecessor, launched A Bridge Home, he said that these shelters, people were going to move in for 3 months and then transition into something permanent. And people ended up staying for years. And I've even interviewed people who were in the Bridge Home, got Section 8, lost their Section 8, and were back on the street. So I think just continually following up with those stories and seeing, did the problem actually get solved, or did it just get moved, or did it just get, solved for a few months, but then ultimately the encampment came back?
It's saved. The politicians are calling them tiny homes, but they're really tiny shacks meant for lawnmowers. Thank you, Pete White, for that line. But what they don't talk about, and with the bridge, there's like a 15% success rate of moving people from the shelter or bridge home or whatever you want to call these things. With the amount of homelessness we have, that it's not going to even put a dent into it. And they don't talk about it. They say it's temporary, but there's no temporary. And then they don't talk about the people being exited back outside and how homeless sweeps and criminalization are all attached to it. I love what you wrote for here. And you said, just talked about how we need to, share the good, the bad, the ugly. But you also commented here that success stories, we have to highlight programs that work. Can you talk about that?
First off, selfishly, for our own mental health, to avoid going insane, it's good to throw in uplifting stories about the human spirit, people who have overcome and found success, like that, the Tanu story I spoke about. He was just, a jolt for the soul. I don't know any other way to describe it. Just everything that he had been through, and the fact that he was able to access this program that really did, I mean, not just address his homelessness, but address the root causes of his addiction and come to terms with things that had happened in his childhood and what was really fueling, his fall into the streets. So I think that it's just something that you have to do if you're going to do this work. I think also to give the public some encouragement. I think to show public officials which programs are working, that we shouldn't be hesitant to shine a light on the things that are good, that are showing improvement. And yeah, it's just the only way you personally as a journalist are going to keep going is if you can give yourself, a rainbow every once in a while.
When I first started doing outreach here in Los Angeles, my boss said, keep a tape in your head of the success stories, because they don't happen often enough. And you're going to have to replay that in your head to keep yourself motivated. How do you take care of your own mental health or wellness reporting on these hard topics?
I try to be very purpose driven, and I just feel like I'm extremely honored to have the platform that I have. I feel extremely thankful that my career trajectory worked out, that I ended up at Spectrum. It's truly a blessing. I had actually left TV news before Spectrum launched because I was just feeling so worn out and beat up by the stories that we were telling, chasing crime scene tape. It was kind of careening from tragedy to tragedy every day. And I just felt like the more I was moving up in my career, it was compounding that instead of giving me relief from that. And I was actually working at a small newspaper and driving down the highway when our current VP was on NPR and announcing they were going to launch a new television station in LA, that it was going to be focused on community reporting and beats and uplifting stories, and that they weren't going to do random crime or police chases. And I just started yelling at the radio that this was the perfect job for me. And even when I started, like, I was so jaded, I didn't really know how they were going to keep this going, if they were going to cave to the pressures of just trying to compete with everyone else and look like everyone else. And I'm just so proud to work at a place where we're telling really good, real, true stories of Los Angeles. We don't just parachute into communities when something bad happens. We actually cover where we live. And I think that that's just what keeps me going, because it's so rare in journalism to have a job like this that's fulfilling, and you feel like you're making a difference, and you feel like you're really impacting people's lives. So besides that, working out, meditation, spending time with my family, all those other good things, drinking water, getting rest. Checking all the boxes.
We've talked about how wonderful Spectrum News One is. And if I was ever going to go back into broadcast, it's where I would want to work. I've been very impressed. And I mean, you're really lucky that you have support, right? Some reporters, broadcast or print, might not have that. How would you recommend that they advocate to tell an authentic story of homelessness?
Yeah, I would just say, anytime that you're sent to cover an encampment, whether it's a major sweep, an inside safe operation, a housing operation, neighbors complaining, a lot of times I realize these other reporters, the newsroom is sending them to this place. But I just always think that it's worth it to try to reach out to the actual encampment and not necessarily approaching it in an accusatory way. I just think that I try to be really aware of power dynamics, and that as journalists, our job is to speak truth to power. And I can be aggressive when it comes to interviewing the powerful people who are in charge. But if someone's living in a tent or a broken down RV or in a shelter, that is not the person in power to be wielding your weapon of choice, the mic, at. That is the person to be trying to understand how they got here, at least offering to tell their side of the situation. And again, Mark and I talk, like, sometimes you maybe don't necessarily think that they are sympathetic, that some people are nomadic. This is where they've chosen to post up. But I think that it's still worth it always to include that angle.
Could you tell us the story behind the Project Room Key story you did? I happen to know the main character in your story, and you once told me the backstory behind it.
That was actually a crazy day. I hadn't met him in person, but he knew I was coming to the encampment. The Project Room Key where he was ended. He kind of got stuck in limbo. He couldn't get to the next building because he lost his paperwork. When I went to go interview him, it was when he was setting up in a new encampment just outside of the former Project Room Key hotel in a neighborhood that's actually controlled by what he told me was MS-13 street gang. And I showed up to interview him, and luckily I was running late because apparently I got there just minutes after gang members had shown up and essentially threatened the encampment. And so when I first saw Daniel, he was running down the street and told me to just start running and to not stop. And so we ended up going to a mall in downtown LA where there was security, just so I could be like, well, what is happening? And he described basically the whole situation. And I said, okay, let's just get to the LA Grand, which was the new Project Room Key spot. Just in walking there, that's how I shot the interview. Was I just put a microphone on him
on your phone?
He just told me the whole story. Yeah, on my phone. As we walked to the Grand, and his concern that he wasn't going to be able to get in, that he had left all his belongings in this tent, that he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to get back there. But to me, Daniel really showed just the frustration of the system because, he had been in the system. They should have had all of his paperwork. It shouldn't have been that complicated to transfer him to a new facility. And he was just super frustrated. But that day, he was just really open about his struggles with sobriety, but the fact that he didn't think that he would ever get sober without housing, but that he wasn't willing to promise sobriety in return for housing. So
you got that person that I know is not the easiest person to get an interview from, but you got great interview from him. You led with empathy. Kate, thank you so very much for spending time with me and speaking about the importance of journalism covering homelessness.
Thank you for having me.